Further, moving on to theory of biogenesis. Now, theory of biogenesis suggests that life originated from pre-existing living organisms. Now, what do you mean by pre-existing forms? That means for life to exist, life must exist at the onset, that is already it must have existed. So life comes from already existing life. That is what is referred to as biogenesis. You can think of it as how a cell came into existence. If a cell is existing today, there must have been a mother cell from which it came. So life originated from pre-existing life is what is the theory of biogenesis. And here you can see Francisco Redi's experiment where he used boiled meat and he kept it in a jar. And the jar was open, and only when the jar was open he saw maggots landing on them, and they laid eggs which developed into the flies which laid eggs which developed into maggots. However, when the meat was kept in a jar which was sealed with a rubber cork as shown here, the meat did not get contaminated at all. There were no maggots growing on the meat. Similarly, when there was a cheesecloth that was tied to the mouth of the jar, he saw that the flies could not access the meat. So this clearly indicated that the life that is originating or life that is appearing on the piece or the chunk of meat is from an external source, that is from the flies. And of course, even Lazzaro Spallanzani performed similar experiments. He used a broth, he heated the broth, and when he kept the flask open, only then did he see contamination of the broth with microorganisms. But when he sealed the mouth of the flask, he saw that there was no contamination at all. A similar experiment was performed by Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur is well known for his swan-necked flask experiment. He drew the neck of the flask into an S-shaped curved section, as you can see over here, and that's why this flask is called a swan-necked flask. And he saw that when boiled the broth in the swan-necked flask, even with the opening of this flask kept open, it was still open, it was not sealed entirely, the flask or the broth remained completely uncontaminated. Now, what does this suggest? This suggested, and he also observed dust particles getting collected in the bent part of the swan neck flask over here. And when he observed, he came to know that these dust particles in the surrounding atmosphere, he proposed that the dust particles in the surrounding atmosphere are the carriers of these microorganisms, and since they cannot make their way all the way into the broth, they did not contaminate the broth. But here also it indicates that life is coming from an external source. Life is not originating suddenly and spontaneously within the broth.